If you stood on the endless rolling steppes of southern Russia in the first days of July 1943, the first thing you would have noticed was the silence. It was a heavy, unnatural silence. The tall steppe grass, just beginning to dry in the summer heat, whispered in the wind. The larks sang in the high blue sky. To a casual observer, the landscape looked empty, a vast ocean of yellow wheat and green ravines stretching to the horizon. But beneath the grass, the earth was alive, hidden in thousands of miles of camouflaged trenches, bunkers, and dugouts were nearly 2 million men holding their breath. In the forests and hollows behind them, thousands of steel engines sat cold, covered in branches and netting, waiting for the order to ignite. This was the calm before the apocalypse. We often think of Stalingrad as the turning point of World War II. And psychologically, it was. But militarily, the German war machine was not broken at Stalingrad. It was wounded, yes, it had lost an army. But it still possessed the deadliest armored force in the world. It still held the strategic initiative. It still believed with a terrifying certainty that one decisive summer offensive could stabilize the Eastern Front, shatter the Red Army, and force Stalin to the negotiating table. This is the story of that offensive. It is the story of Operation Citadel. It is a story not just of generals moving flags on a map, but of a clash of industries, a clash of ideologies, and a clash of pure attrition. It is the story of the moment when the irresistible force of the German Blitzkrieg finally met the immovable object of the Soviet defense in depth. What was about to happen on this patch of Russian soil, roughly the size of England, would determine the fate of the 20th century. If Germany won here, the war in the East could drag on for years. If they lost, the road to Berlin would be thrown wide open. This is the Battle of Kursk. Chapter 1. Cold Open, the biggest tank battle. Ever to understand Kursk, you have to try to visualize the numbers, even though they are almost impossible for the human mind to truly grasp. In previous wars, battles were fought by regiments or divisions, a few thousand men, perhaps 100 horses or a dozen cannons. At Kursk, the scale was planetary. On the morning of July 5, 1943, the German Wehrmacht had massed nearly 3,000 tanks and assault guns. These weren't just the light Panzer that had raced across France 3 years earlier. These were the new breed, the heavy metal, the Tigers, the Panthers, the Ferdinands. Facing them, the Soviet Red Army had assembled a staggering force of over 5,000 armored vehicles. Combine the infantry, and you have nearly 3 million human beings packed into a single sector of the front. That is more than the entire population of Chicago or Rome at the time, all armed with automatic weapons, inhabiting a kill zone of overlapping artillery fire. Speaking of artillery, the concentration of firepower was unprecedented. The Soviets alone had concentrated over 20,000 guns and mortars. When the artillery preparation began, the sound was not heard as a series of explosions. Survivors described it as a single, continuous ripping scream that did not stop for hours. The overpressure from the shockwaves was enough to rupture eardrums and cause internal bleeding miles away from the impact zones. The sheer density of metal involved led the Germans to call this a material Schlacht, a battle of material. It wasn't about maneuver or clever flanking, it was a grinder, a test of who could throw more steel into the fire before the furnace broke. But why here, why now? The date, July 5th, is crucial. It is the height of summer. The Russian roads, which are swamps of mud in the spring and frozen sheets of ice in the winter, are now hard and dry. This is tank weather. For the German High Command, this was the window. They knew that with every passing day, the American and British forces in the West were growing stronger. They knew that Allied bombers were turning German cities into rubble. They knew that the Soviet factories beyond the Urals were churning out T-34 tanks at a rate Germany could never hope to match. Adolf Hitler and his generals looked at the map and saw one massive problem and one massive opportunity. A bulge, a protrusion in the front line that stuck out 150 miles into German-held territory, centered on the railway hub of Kursk. Inside that bulge were 5 Soviet armies. If the Germans could pinch that bulge off at the base, cut it from the north and the south simultaneously, they would trap those 5 armies in a cauldron. They would capture hundreds of thousands of prisoners, destroy a huge portion of Soviet tank strength, and shorten their own front line by hundreds of miles. It was a seductive plan. It was a classic Prussian maneuver, the Kesselschlacht, the cauldron battle. They had done it before at Kiev, at Minsk, at Vyazma. They assumed they could do it again. But the Red Army of 1943 was not the Red Army of 1941. They were no longer the disorganized, desperate force that had crumbled during Operation Barbarossa. They had learned, they had survived, and most importantly, they were waiting. As the sun rose on July 5th, the German crews climbed into their tanks. The air smelled of diesel fumes, cordite, and dry dust. Commanders peered through periscopes, watching for the signal flare. They were the tip of the spear, the elite of the Panzerwaffe. They believed in their machines. They believed in their training. But as the engines roared to life and the tracks began to churn the black earth, they were driving into a trap so elaborate, so deep and so deadly that it would change the very definition of warfare. The greatest tank battle in history was about to begin, and it would not end the way anyone in Berlin had planned. Chapter 2. After Stalingrad. Germany's last chance. To really understand why the Germans were willing to gamble everything on this one attack, we have to look at the ghost that was haunting every German soldier and general, Stalingrad. 5 months earlier, in February 1943, the unimaginable had happened. The German Sixth Army, the conquerors of Paris, the pride of the Wehrmacht, had been erased from existence. Field Marshal Paulus had surrendered. 90,000 German soldiers walked into Soviet captivity, most never to return. The shock of Stalingrad went far beyond the loss of manpower. It shattered the myth of invincibility. For the first time, the German public began to whisper that the war might actually be lost. Morale on the home front plummeted. Germany's allies, Italy, Romania, Hungary, began looking for exit strategies. In the occupied territories, resistance movements grew bolder. But the crisis wasn't just psychological, it was operational. After the surrender at Stalingrad, the Soviet steamroller didn't stop. They kept pushing. The Red Army launched a massive winter offensive, tearing huge gaps in the German lines. For a few terrifying weeks in early 1943, it looked like the entire German Eastern Front might collapse completely. Enter Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. Manstein is widely considered the most brilliant operational mind of the German military. In February and March of 1943, amidst the chaos and the retreat, he pulled off a miracle. He orchestrated a brilliant counterstroke known as the backhand blow. He allowed the overextended Soviet forces to advance until they were exhausted, and then he struck them in the flank. He recaptured the city of Kharkov and stabilized the front line. It was this victory, the miracle on the Donets, that saved the German army in the east. But it also created the geography for the next battle. When the fighting finally died down due to the spring thaw, the Rasputitsa, where the Russian soil turns into a thick, impassable gumbo that can swallow a truck whole, the front line had settled into a peculiar shape. The Germans held Orel in the north and Kharkov in the south, but between them the Soviet lines pushed deep to the west, creating a massive salient centered on the city of Kursk. This bulge was about 150 miles wide and 100 miles deep. To a map reader, a salient is both a threat and a target. It is a threat because the enemy inside the bulge can launch attacks outward in any direction, but it is a target because the enemy is surrounded on 3 sides. Hitler looked at this map and saw Operation Citadel. The plan was simple on paper. General Model's 9th Army would attack from the north, and General Hoth's 4th Panzer Army would attack from the south. They would meet east of Kursk, slicing the neck of the bulge and strangling everything inside. However, there was a fierce debate in the German High Command about how and when to do this. Manstein, the architect of the stabilization, wanted to attack immediately. He argued for a quick strike in May as soon as the ground dried out. His logic was sound. The Soviets were still reorganizing after the winter battles. Their defenses were not yet ready. If the Germans hit them hard and fast in May, they might catch the Red Army off balance. But Hitler hesitated, and he wasn't the only one. General Model, who would lead the northern attack, showed Hitler aerial reconnaissance photos of the Soviet defenses. "Mein Führer," he essentially said, "they are digging in. If we attack now, we might not have enough strength to break through." Hitler, ever the gambler, decided to wait. He didn't want a partial victory, he wanted a total annihilation. He wanted a victory so crushing that it would restore German prestige in the eyes of the world. He believed that if he waited a few weeks, or maybe a month, the German industry would deliver new weapons that would tip the scales. This decision to wait, to delay, to postpone was arguably the single most critical error of the 1943 campaign. While Hitler waited for his wonder weapons, the strategic clock was ticking. In North Africa, the German Afrika Korps surrendered in May. The Allies were gathering in the Mediterranean, preparing to jump into Sicily. The bombing of the Ruhr Valley was crippling German industry. Germany needed a win. They needed to shorten the Eastern Front to free up divisions to send to Italy and France. Operation Citadel was not just an attack, it was a desperate bid to regain control of the war. It was Germany's last chance to dictate the terms of engagement before the sheer weight of Allied numbers crushed them. So, the order went out. Wait. Wait for the new tanks. Wait for the new divisions. The offensive was pushed from May to June. Then, from June to July. And with every day that Hitler waited, the Soviets dug another mile of trenches. With every day of delay, another trainload of Soviet anti-tank mines arrived at Kursk. The Germans were giving their enemy the one thing they could not afford to give: time. Chapter 3: Hitler's Wonder Weapons. Why did Hitler wait? What was worth risking the entire summer campaign for? The answer lay in the steelworks of the Ruhr and the factories of Henschel, Porsche, and MAN. Hitler had become obsessed with the idea of technological superiority. He believed that the German soldier was superior, but that he was being let down by inferior equipment compared to the Soviet T-34. The T-34 had been a nasty shock to the Germans in 1941. It was faster, better armored, and more reliable than anything the Germans had. For 2 years, the Wehrmacht had been scrambling to catch up. By the summer of 1943, they believed they finally had the tools to dominate the battlefield. There were 3 specific machines that Hitler pinned his hopes on. These were the wonder weapons of Operation Citadel. First, there was the Tiger Y. By Kursk, the Tiger had already seen combat, but never in these numbers. This was a monster, 57 tons of hardened steel, armed with the dreaded 88mm gun, originally an anti-aircraft weapon. It could pop the turret off a T-34 from 2 kilometers away, long before the Soviet tank could even get into range. The Tiger was a breakthrough tank. Its armor was so thick that Soviet crews reported watching their shells bounce off it, like peas off a wall. Hitler authorized the formation of special heavy tank battalions, concentrating these beasts to punch holes in the enemy line. Second, and perhaps most important to the future of tank warfare, was the Panther. The Panther was Germany's direct answer to the T-34. It had sloped armor, wide tracks for better mobility, and a high-velocity 75mm gun that had even better penetration than the Tiger's 88. It was sleek, modern, and on paper the best tank in the world. Hitler was infatuated with it. He demanded that as many Panthers as possible be rushed to the front. He delayed the operation specifically to wait for the first few hundred Panthers to roll off the assembly lines. But there was a problem. The Panther was rushed. It hadn't been properly tested. The engines were prone to overheating and catching fire. The transmissions were fragile. The crews had barely had time to train in them. When they arrived at the railheads near Kursk, many Panthers broke down before they even reached the assembly areas. They were thoroughbred racehorses being asked to pull a plough through a swamp. And then there was the Ferdinand, also known as the Elephant. This was a strange, terrifying hybrid designed by Ferdinand Porsche. It was a massive tank destroyer built on the chassis of a rejected Tiger prototype. It weighed 65 tons. It carried an even longer 88mm gun. It had 200mm of frontal armor, virtually impenetrable to any weapon the Soviets possessed. But the Ferdinand was a symbol of everything wrong with German military planning. It was over-engineered and incredibly heavy. But its fatal flaw was almost comical in its tragedy. It had no machine gun. It was designed to kill tanks at long range, but it had no defense against infantry. If Soviet soldiers got close enough, they could simply walk up to the Ferdinand and throw Molotov cocktails into the engine vents, and the crew inside could do nothing about it. Hitler was convinced that these three weapons, the Tiger, the Panther, and the Ferdinand, would slice through the Soviet defenses like a hot knife through butter. He envisioned panzer wedges called Panzerkeil, with Tigers at the tip and Panthers fanning out to the sides, smashing anything in their path. The logistics of getting these machines to the front were a nightmare. The German rail network was stretched to the breaking point. Trains loaded with these heavy beasts crawled across Eastern Europe, constantly harassed by partisans blowing up tracks. When the trains finally arrived, the reality set in. The new Panthers were leaking fuel. The Ferdinands were sinking into the soft ground. The mechanics were working 24-hour shifts just to keep the engines running. General Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg and the Inspector General of Armored Troops, warned Hitler. He argued that the Panther was not ready. He argued that the terrain at Kursk was too predictable. He famously asked Hitler, "Why do we want to attack in the east at all this year? Do you think anyone rarely cares whether we capture Kursk or not?" Hitler admitted that the thought of the attack made his stomach, but he felt he had no choice. He was trapped by the logic of his own war. He needed a victory to keep his allies in line and to keep the German people believing. And he believed, with a fanatic's zeal, that the sheer quality of German engineering would overcome the quantity of Russian steel. He was betting the war on unproven technology. He was betting that 700 Panthers and Tigers could do the work of thousands of older tanks. But while Hitler was counting his tanks and reading spec sheets in the Wolf's Lair, something else was happening on the other side of the line. The Soviets weren't just sitting there, they were watching. Thanks to a spy ring in Switzerland known as Lucy, and thanks to the British sharing ultra-intercepts, Stalin had a copy of Hitler's orders almost as soon as the German generals did. The Red Army knew exactly where the new Tigers were gathering. They knew exactly where the Panthers would detrain, and they were preparing a welcome committee that would turn Hitler's technical marvels into burning heaps of scrap metal. The stage was set, the wonder weapons were in position, the delay was over, the engines were revving, but the element of surprise, the most crucial ingredient, in the Blitzkrieg formula had been lost months ago. The Germans were about to drive their shiny new tanks into the most heavily fortified place on the surface of the earth. Chapter 4. Zhukov builds the ultimate trap. While Hitler was paralyzed by indecision, waiting for his factories to deliver the Panthers, the Soviet Union was engaged in one of the greatest feats of military engineering in human history. But Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, the top Soviet commanders, argued for something different. They proposed a strategy of calculated patience. They would not attack. They would wait. They would let the Germans smash themselves against the Soviet defenses, bleeding their panzer divisions dry, and then, only when the German beast was exhausted and toothless, would the Red Army launch its own crushing offensive. Stalin grudgingly agreed, and so the digging began. If you could have looked down on the Kursk salient in June 1943, the earth would have looked like an intricate, terrified nervous system. The Soviets didn't just build a defensive line, they built a fortress the size of a country. They constructed not one, not two, but 8 successive defensive belts, stretching nearly 200 miles deep. Civilians, mostly women and teenagers from the local villages, moved 50 million cubic meters of earth by hand. They dug 6,000 miles of trenches, enough to stretch from Moscow to Vladivostok. But the real devil was in the details. The Soviets turned the steppe into a devil's garden. They laid mines at a density never seen before, up to 3,000 mines per square mile in critical sectors. In total, they buried over 1 million mines. These weren't just scattered randomly, they were placed in channels designed to funnel German tanks directly into the kill zones of anti-tank guns. This was the birth of the pack front. In the past, anti-tank guns were spread out evenly along the line. At Kursk, the Soviets clustered them in groups of 10 or 12 under a single commander. These guns would hold their fire until the German tanks were terrifyingly close, sometimes just 200 meters away. Then, on a single signal, an entire battery would open fire on one target. A Tiger tank might survive one hit, but it couldn't survive 10 hits simultaneously from 3 different angles. To support this, the Red Army moved in their own reserves. They hid entire tank armies in the forests. They camouflaged airfields. They created dummy positions with fake guns and fake tanks to draw German fire. The deception, or maskirovka, was so total that while the Germans knew there were defenses, they had no idea of the sheer depth of the nightmare awaiting them. Intelligence was the ace up Zhukov's sleeve. The Lucy spy ring in Switzerland and British Ultra intercepts provided the Soviets with the German order of battle. They knew the unit names, they knew the supply routes, they knew the timing. In the final days before the attack, the tension in the Soviet trenches was palpable. Soldiers sharpened their shovels to use as axes in hand-to-hand combat. Political officers handed out flyers that read, "Not one step back, the fate of the motherland is in your hands." On the night of July 4th, mere hours before the German attack was scheduled to begin, Soviet engineers crept into no man's land and captured a German combat engineer clearing mines. Under interrogation, he revealed the exact start time of the offensive, 3:00 a.m. Zhukov didn't wait. At 2:20 a.m., 40 minutes before the Germans were set to attack, the Soviet artillery opened fire. Thousands of guns roared into the darkness, hammering the German assembly areas. The German troops, packed into their jumping-off points, were caught completely off guard. Operation Citadel had begun, not with a German blitz, but with a Soviet thunderclap. Chapter 5. The Northern Pincer. Model smashes into a brick wall. In the north, the German assault was led by Field Marshal Walter Model and his 9th Army. Model was a defensive genius, a firefighter known for saving desperate situations. But here, he was asked to be the hammer. His objective was to punch through the Soviet lines north of Kursk and drive south to meet Manstein. But from the very first hour on July 5th, things went wrong. Shutterstock. Model's attack ran into a wall of lead and fire. The sheer density of the Soviet minefields was catastrophic. The heavy Ferdinand tank destroyers, those 65-ton monsters Hitler loved, began to falter almost immediately. They didn't get shot, they got stuck. As they crawled into the minefields, their tracks were blown off. Immobilized, these steel beasts became sitting ducks for Soviet artillery. And because the Ferdinand lacked a machine gun for close defense, brave Soviet infantrymen, known as tank hunters, could crawl up to the blind spots of the vehicle and disable them with satchel charges or flamethrowers. The German infantry, trying to follow the tanks, were pinned down by withering machine gun fire from bunkers that seemed to be everywhere. The Soviets had mastered the art of camouflage. A grassy hillock would suddenly erupt in fire, wiping out a platoon, and then fall silent again. The focal point of the northern battle became the tiny railway station of Ponieri. History remembers Stalingrad, but for the soldiers of the Ninth Army, Ponieri was the Stalingrad of Kursk. It was a small, dusty village with a water tower, a schoolhouse, and a tractor station. For 4 days it became the center of the universe. The fighting here was savage. The Germans would capture the schoolhouse in the morning with flamethrowers and grenades. The Soviets would counterattack at noon with T-34s and retake it. By evening, the Germans would call in Stuka dive bombers to level the building, only for the Soviets to emerge from the basements the next morning. The hill known as Hill 253.5 changed hands dozens of times. The slopes were covered in a carpet of grey and olive-green uniforms. The air was so thick with dust and smoke that pilots couldn't distinguish friend from foe. Model, realizing his schedule was falling apart, threw in his reserves. He committed his fresh panzer divisions, hoping to crack the line. But for every mile he advanced, he found another Soviet defensive belt. He wasn't breaking through, he was chewing his way through concrete. By July 10th, the Ninth Army was exhausted. They had advanced only about 6 to 8 miles. They hadn't even breached the second major defensive belt, let alone the third or fourth. They had lost tens of thousands of men and hundreds of tanks. Model was a realist. He looked at the butcher's bill and he looked at the map. He realized that the breakthrough was impossible. He had smashed his army into a brick wall, and the wall had barely cracked. In the north, Operation Citadel was effectively dead in the water after less than a week. But in the south, the story was dangerously different. Chapter 6: Prokhorovka. The southern clash that shook the world. While Model was bleeding to death in the north, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein in the south was dangerously close to succeeding. Manstein's 4th Panzer Army was the most powerful armored force Germany had ever assembled. It was spearheaded by the elite 2 SS Panzer Corps, containing the premier divisions of the Nazi state, Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf. These men were ideological fanatics, veterans of every campaign, equipped with the best Tigers and Panthers. Unlike in the north, the terrain in the south was more favorable for tanks, open, rolling fields perfect for maneuver. And Manstein commanded with a terrifying aggression. On July 5th, the SS divisions hit the Soviet lines like a sledgehammer. They suffered heavy losses in the minefields, yes. General Hoth, commanding the 4th Panzer Army, watched as his Panthers caught fire and his infantry were mowed down, but they kept pushing. Through sheer tactical brilliance and brute force, the Germans began to crack the Soviet defenses. They pierced the first belt, then the second. By July 9th, they had penetrated nearly 20 miles into the Soviet rear. Panic began to flutter through the Soviet command posts. If Manstein broke through here, he could swing behind Kursk and encircle the Soviet armies despite Model's failure in the north. The critical moment came on July 11th. The German spearhead reached the Sel River and looked toward a small settlement that would give its name to the most famous tank engagement in history, Prokhorovka. The Soviet High Command realized they were on the brink of disaster. They had one card left to play, the strategic reserve. This was the steppe front, a massive force held back for the counter-offensive. Stalin ordered Marshal Konev to release the 5th Guards Tank Army, commanded by General Pavel Rotmistrov. Rotmistrov's orders were simple and suicidal: stop the Germans at Prokhorovka at all costs. Rotmistrov force-marched his tanks over 200 miles in 3 days to get to the battlefield. Mechanics worked on the move, fixing tracks and engines as they rolled. On the night of July 11th, they arrived at the assembly areas. The morning of July 12, 1943 dawned hot and oppressive. Thunderstorms loomed on the horizon. At 8:30 a.m. the ground began to shake. On the German side, the SS divisions were preparing to advance. On the Soviet side, Rotmistrov gave the signal, "Steel, steel, steel." Over the crest of the hill, hundreds of Soviet T-34s charged at full speed. They carried infantry riding on their hulls. Their goal was to close the distance. They knew the German Tigers had better range and better guns. If the Soviets sat back, they would be picked off. So they charged, trying to get under the guard of the German long guns. What followed was a scene of industrial madness. It was not a neatly choreographed battle. It was a swirling, choking melee. The dust kicked up by thousands of tracks was so thick that the sun was blotted out. Drivers were effectively blind, steering by instinct and terror. Tanks crashed into each other. T-34s, unable to penetrate the thick frontal armor of the Tigers, rammed them, locking tracks in a suicidal embrace so their crews could fire into the German vision slits or fuel tanks. Turrets were blown into the air, ammunition cooked off, turning tanks into incinerators. The airwaves were filled with screams and curses in Russian and German. Commanders lost control of their units. It became a war of individual crews fighting for survival. One Soviet tanker recalled seeing a Tiger tank crush a T-34 flat, only to be blown up by another T-34 seconds later. Men bailed out of burning tanks, their uniforms on fire, rolling in the wheat fields, only to be gunned down by machine fire or crushed by passing tracks. By the time the sun set, the field at Prokhorovka was a graveyard of armor. The smoke from hundreds of burning wrecks drifted across the steppe. Historians still argue about the exact numbers. Soviet propaganda later claimed they destroyed 400 German tanks that day. The reality was lower. The Germans likely lost around 60 to 80 tanks totally destroyed or damaged beyond repair in the immediate sector, while the Soviets lost hundreds. Tactically, the Germans had actually won the engagement. They held the field and had inflicted horrific losses on Rotmistrov's army. But strategically, Prokhorovka was the death knell of the offensive. The 5th Guards Tank Army had been mauled, yes, but it had stopped the German advance. It had forced the SS divisions to halt and regroup. The momentum of the Blitzkrieg had been absorbed by the bodies of Soviet tankers. Manstein's spearhead was blunted. And while the fires of Prokhorovka were still burning, a message was traveling from Berlin that would render all the bloodshed meaningless. Chapter 7. Hitler pulls the plug. On July 13th, the day after Prokhorovka, a plane landed at the German headquarters at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. Field Marshals Manstein and Klug were summoned to meet the Führer. The mood in the room was funeral. Hitler looked aged, his shoulders hunched. He didn't want to talk about Kursk. He wanted to talk about the Mediterranean. While the tanks were burning on the Russian steppe, the Western Allies had made their move. On July 10th, British and American forces had landed in Sicily, Operation Husky. The second front that Stalin had been demanding for years was finally becoming a reality. The situation in Italy was catastrophic. Mussolini's fascist regime was crumbling. The Italian army was surrendering in droves. Hitler feared that if Italy fell, the Allies would be on the Austrian border within weeks. He needed troops to send south. He needed them now. Hitler looked at his generals and uttered the words that ended Germany's last great offensive. Operation Citadel is cancelled. Manstein was furious. He argued passionately. "Mein Führer," he pleaded, "the enemy is reeling. We have destroyed their armored reserves. Victory is within our grasp. We cannot stop now." Manstein believed that if he could just keep pushing for a few more days, he could break the Soviet southern front and salvage a victory. But Hitler was looking at the bigger picture, and the picture was black. He ordered the elite 2 SS Panzer Corps, the very tip of Manstein's spear, to be withdrawn from the line immediately and prepared for transport to Italy. Without those elite divisions, Manstein's attack was finished. The 4th Panzer Army had to halt. The 9th Army in the north was already digging in to defend against Soviet counterattacks. It was an anticlimactic end to the decisive battle. After months of build-up, millions of shells fired, and horrific casualties, the offensive was called off after just 8 days. The German army had driven into a cul-de-sac and was now being told to back out. But backing out is not easy when you are locked in a death grip with a bear. The Germans thought they could just cancel the operation and return to their starting lines. They thought the Soviets were too exhausted from the defense to do anything about it. They were wrong. The Red Army hadn't just been defending, they had been coiling a spring. And now they were about to release it. Chapter 8. Soviet Steamroller, Kutuzov and Rumyantsev. The genius of the Soviet plan was not just the defense, it was the immediate transition to offense. Zhukov had held back massive reserves, entire fronts that hadn't even seen combat yet. On July 12th, the same day as the clash at Prokhorovka, the Red Army launched Operation Kutuzov in the north. This wasn't a tentative probe. This was a massive multi-army smash directed at the Ural Bulge north of Kursk, right into the rear of Model's 9th Army. Model, who had been trying to break through to Kursk, suddenly found himself fighting for his life. He had to strip his tank divisions from the front line and rush them back to save his supply lines. The hunters became the hunted. The German infantry, exhausted from a week of attacking, were suddenly swarmed by fresh Soviet divisions. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin, couldn't cover the retreat. The Ural Bulge, which the Germans had held for 2 years, began to collapse. Then on August 3rd, the second hammer blow fell, Operation Rumyantsev. This was the counterstroke in the south against Manstein. The Soviets launched a massive attack toward Belgorod and Kharkov. The German lines, thinned out by the transfer of the SS divisions to Italy, shattered. The scale of the Soviet advance was terrifying. This was the deep battle doctrine in action. Once they punched a hole, they didn't stop to consolidate. They poured mobile tank corps through the gap, driving deep into the German rear, ignoring strong points, cutting rail lines, and spreading chaos. Behind the German lines, the partisan war erupted. Thousands of Soviet partisans emerged from the forests to blow up bridges and rail tracks, paralyzing German logistics. The Wehrmacht was fighting a war on the front, a war in the rear, and a war against time. On August 5th, the Soviets liberated Belgorod. On August 23rd, they stormed into Kharkov, the 4th and final time that tragic city changed hands in the war. The psychological impact on the German soldier was devastating. For years they had told themselves that even if they were outnumbered, They were superior tacticians. They believed that in the summer, on dry ground, they were unbeatable. Kursk destroyed that belief. They had attacked in the summer, they had used their best tanks, they had their best generals, and they had been stopped, beaten, and thrown back hundreds of miles. By September, the Red Army had advanced nearly 200 miles. They reached the banks of the Dnieper River. The strategic initiative had passed permanently to the Soviet Union. The Wehrmacht would never launch a major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front again. From this moment on, the road led only one way: west. Back to Poland, back to Germany, back to Berlin. The steamroller had begun to move, and nothing on earth could stop it now. Chapter 9. The cost and why. Germany could never recover. When the smoke finally cleared over the blackened steppes of Kursk, the bill for Operation Citadel came due. And it was staggering. To look at the raw numbers is to misunderstand the tragedy of what happened to the German war machine. If you simply count the dead bodies and the burning tanks, the Soviet Union suffered far more. The Red Army lost over 800,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. They lost over 6,000 tanks and guns. In almost any other war in any other century, such losses would have signaled a catastrophic defeat. The Germans, by comparison, lost roughly 200,000 men and perhaps 700 to 1,000 tanks. On a spreadsheet, it looks like a tactical victory for the Wehrmacht. They inflicted a kill ratio of nearly 4-1. But war is not played on a spreadsheet. It is played in factories, and it is played in the minds of men. The catastrophe for Germany wasn't just the number of tanks lost, it was which tanks were lost, and more importantly, who was inside them. The Panzerwaffe, the German armoured force, was a fraternity. It relied on a corps of highly trained veterans. These were men who had fought in Poland, in France, in Greece, and during the invasion of Russia. They were the experts. They knew how to angle their armour, they knew how to coordinate by radio, they knew how to keep their machines running in sub-zero temperatures. At Kursk, that core was hollowed out. When a Tiger tank burned at Prokhorovka, Germany didn't just lose a machine, they lost a crew with 3 years of combat experience. You can build a new tank in a week. You cannot build a veteran tank commander in a week. It takes years. Germany lost its seed corn. The junior officers, the NCOs, the men who held the army together, they died in the minefields of Poniri and the wheat fields of the south. From this point on, the quality of the German army began a steep, terminal decline. The replacements were teenagers and old men, rushed to the front with barely any training, thrown into machines they barely knew how to operate. Then there was the industrial disparity. While Germany was struggling to repair its damaged Panthers, the Soviet factories beyond the Urals were operating at peak efficiency. They were churning out T-34s like sausages. For every tank the Germans destroyed at Kursk, the Soviets built 2 more. The Americans were sending thousands of trucks and tons of steel via Lend-Lease. The German repair depots were overwhelmed. Hundreds of damaged tanks that could have been fixed had to be abandoned because the German army was retreating so fast they couldn't tow them away. They were forced to blow up their own precious Tigers to prevent them from falling into Soviet hands. This was the breaking point of the German strategy. Hitler had gambled that quality could beat quantity. He believed that 1 Tiger was worth 10 T-34s. But at Kursk, he learned a brutal lesson. Quantity has a quality all its own. Furthermore, the strategic reserve was gone. The divisions that were meant to defend Italy and France had been chewed up in Russia. When the Allies landed in Normandy a year later, the German response was weaker because the best divisions had been buried in the Russian soil back in 1943. The retreat that followed Kursk was not an orderly withdrawal, it was a race for the Dnieper River. The Germans hoped to establish a new defensive line, the so-called East Wall. But they didn't have the men to man it, nor the concrete to build it. The Red Army simply washed over it. Germany had spent its last gold coin. It was now bankrupt, fighting on borrowed time. Chapter 10. Legacy. The battle that broke the Wehrmacht. Why does Kursk matter today? Why do we still study it? Because it marks the definitive end of an era in warfare. Before July 1943, the world lived in fear of the German Blitzkrieg. The image of the unstoppable German tank column, supported by screaming Stuka dive bombers, was the nightmare of every Allied general. The Germans had revolutionized warfare with the concept of rapid maneuver, encirclement, and shock. Kursk killed the Blitzkrieg. For the first time, a Blitzkrieg offensive was not just stopped. It was stopped in its tracks, ground down, and thrown back before it achieved any of its major objectives. Zhukov proved that a well-prepared, deep defense could absorb the shock of an armored assault and snap the attacker's spine. The myth of German invincibility was shattered forever. The German soldier knew it, the Soviet soldier knew it, and the world knew it. After Kursk, the psychology of the Eastern Front inverted. The Soviet soldier who had spent 2 years terrified of being encircled realized that he was now the one doing the encircling. The hunter became the prey. Historically, we often point to Stalingrad as the turning point, but Stalingrad was a rescue operation that went wrong. It was a disaster, but the German army was still capable of launching massive attacks afterwards. Kursk was different. Kursk was a deliberate, prepared showdown. It was Germany's Sunday punch. They brought everything they had, and it wasn't enough. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht never launched another strategic offensive in the east. They were permanently on the defensive. They were reactive. They were just trying to hold the line, day by day, mile by mile. The road to Berlin was opened at Kursk. The Soviet advance that began with Operation Kutuzov and Rumyantsev didn't really stop until May 1945. The victories of 1944, the liberation of Ukraine, of Belarus, of Poland, were all made possible because the back of the German Panzer Force was broken on the steppes in July 1943. It also cemented the Soviet Union's position as a superpower. The sheer scale of the victory demonstrated to the Western Allies that the USSR was not going to collapse. It signaled that the post-war map of Europe would be drawn by Soviet tanks. When we look back at the Battle of Kursk, we see the moment the hinge of history turned. It was the clash of the titans. It was the moment when the industrial might of the 20th century was fully unleashed in a cauldron of fire, and from the ashes, a new world order began to emerge. The German generals would write memoirs blaming Hitler, blaming the weather, blaming the mud. But the truth was simpler. They were beaten by a better strategy, a more resilient enemy, and the cold, hard math of total war. Chapter 11. Outro and Call to Action. The Battle of Kursk was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. But it was not the end of the killing. As the Red Army surged forward to the Dnieper, the Wehrmacht began a scorched-earth retreat that left devastation in its wake. But even as the Germans retreated, they remained a dangerous, lethal enemy. The war would drag on for another 2 years of brutal, grinding combat. However, if you think Kursk was a disaster for the Germans, what happened the following summer makes Kursk look like a skirmish. In 1944, on the anniversary of the invasion of Russia, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration. If Kursk broke the Wehrmacht's back, Bagration ripped out its heart. It was a masterclass in deception and destruction that resulted in the complete annihilation of Army Group Center, a defeat worse than Stalingrad and Kursk combined. We are going to cover that massive operation, the destruction of 28 German divisions, and the race to Warsaw in our next deep dive. You do not want to miss that story. So, if you enjoyed this detailed look at the biggest tank battle in history, please destroy that like button, just like Zhukov destroyed the 9th Army. Make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on so you're in the front row when we release the video on Operation Bagration. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next battlefield.